The morning started the way most mornings did in Clover Ridge, Ohio. Quiet streets, frost still sitting on windshields, the smell of someone's coffee drifting through a cracked window somewhere on Maple Run Drive. Raymond Briggs pulled into the parking lot of Harlan's Auto and Body just after 7:15. His truck, a 2009 Chevy Silverado with a transmission that had been grinding for 3 weeks, sat low and reluctant, like it knew it was going to be turned away. Raymond killed the engine and sat for a moment, watching through the glass. The shop was open. The lights were on. A man in a grey uniform was already bent over an engine on the lift. He got out. His daughter, Zoe, 9 years old and still wearing her backpack from the night before because she had packed it at 10 p.m. so she wouldn't forget anything, climbed out behind him. She was carrying a thermos of hot chocolate that she had made herself. She offered him a sip twice on the drive over. He had accepted the second time. Raymond pushed open the shop door, and the bell above it rang once. The woman behind the counter looked up from a clipboard. Her name was Diane Harlan, 53 years old, second-generation owner of the shop her father had opened in 1979. She wore her reading glasses on a chain around her neck and had a way of looking at people that made clear she had already formed an opinion before they finished their sentence. She looked at Raymond. She looked at Zoe. She looked back at Raymond. Raymond said, "Good morning. I called ahead yesterday about a transmission issue on a 2009 Silverado." Diane set her clipboard down slowly. She said, "We're booked out." Raymond said, "The woman I spoke to on the phone told me to come in at 7:15. I have the name she gave me, Sandra." Diane said, "Sandra doesn't schedule." There was a pause. Raymond kept his hands relaxed at his sides. He said, "I drove 20 minutes to get here. I have a work estimate from the symptoms, and I'm happy to leave the truck for a few days if that helps." Diane said, "I told you, we're booked." Her voice had a particular quality to it, not loud, not heated, flat, the way a door sounds when it closes from the inside. Zoe, standing slightly behind Raymond's left shoulder, looked up at Diane. Her thermos was still in both hands. She didn't say anything, but her eyes were doing the thing they did when she was reading a person the way other people read a room. Raymond said, "Is there a manager I could speak with?" Diane said, "You're looking at her." She picked her clipboard back up. Raymond stood there another 3 seconds. Then he nodded, the small, quiet nod of a man who has been told something that isn't true and has decided, for reasons that are his own, not to correct it out loud. He put his hand on Zoe's shoulder. They walked back out. The doorbell rang once on their way out too. Raymond got behind the wheel and sat there with the engine off. Zoe climbed in, set her thermos in the cup holder, and buckled her seatbelt without being asked. She said, "She was lying, right?" Raymond said, "Probably." Zoe said, "Are you going to do something about it?" Raymond looked at the shop, at Diane Harlan, who had moved back to her clipboard like they had already stopped existing. He said, "Already did." Zoe turned and looked at him. He pulled out his phone and opened an app she didn't recognize. He typed something. He put the phone in his shirt pocket. He started the truck. Zoe said, "What did you type?" Raymond said, "A note." She said, "What kind of note?" He pulled out of the parking lot and back onto Route 9 heading south. He said, "The kind that goes in a file." Before we go any further, drop your city in the comments right now. Tell us where you're watching from. If you've ever been turned away from somewhere for reasons that had nothing to do with the reason they gave you, this story is for you. Subscribe and ring that bell, because what happens to Raymond Briggs in the next several hours is something we are not going to let end quietly. Every single detail matters. Stay with us. Raymond Briggs was 38 years old and had been a resident of Clover Ridge for 4 years. Before that, he had been other things in other places. He had grown up in Columbus, the middle child of 3, in a house on Edgemont Avenue, where his mother kept a small garden in the side yard, and his father drove a school bus for the Columbus City District for 22 years. Raymond had been, by most accounts, a serious child, not withdrawn, not unhappy, just serious in the way that some children are serious, where they pay attention to the parts of the world that adults stop noticing. He had done well in school. Not brilliantly, not in a way that made teachers write letters home, but steadily well, the kind of well that is actually harder to sustain because it requires showing up the same way every single morning regardless of what happened the night before. He had gone to Ohio State on a partial scholarship and studied criminal justice because he was interested, genuinely interested, in the architecture of how systems worked and where and why they failed. He had graduated and gone into federal service. The specific nature of that service was not something Raymond discussed at school pickups or neighborhood block parties. When people asked what he did, he said he worked for the government, and when they pressed, he said something about compliance and oversight and the particular tedium of federal paperwork, and most people stopped pressing after that because tedium is the most effective conversation ender ever invented. What Raymond actually did, what he had been doing for 11 years before he arrived in Clover Ridge and continued doing after, was work as a field investigator for the Department of Transportation's Office of Inspector General. His specialty was systemic fraud in federally funded transportation infrastructure contracts. He found the places where money disappeared between approval and completion. He followed it. He documented it. He built cases that took years to build, cases where the paper trail was deliberately buried under 9 layers of legitimate-looking transactions, cases that required patience of the kind that most people don't have and can't learn. He was, by every internal metric that existed, very good at this. His supervisor, a woman named Agent Constance Adeyemi, who ran the Midwest field office out of Cincinnati, had described him in a review 2 years earlier as the most methodical investigator she had managed in 17 years of federal service. She had also written that he was stubborn in the specific and useful way that meant he did not stop when the case got complicated, and he did not cut corners when the case got long. He had been in Clover Ridge for 4 years because the case that had brought him there had not finished yet. His daughter Zoe had not been part of the plan. The plan had been a clean, single life in a neutral location for the duration of an investigation. Then his sister-in-law in Akron had called on a Tuesday night 14 months after Raymond moved to Clover Ridge, and she had been crying in the way that meant something permanent had happened, and Raymond had driven the 40 minutes to Akron at midnight and had come home the next morning with a 9-year-old girl and a duffel bag of her clothes, and a stuffed animal that was missing one eye. Zoe was the daughter of his younger brother David and David's wife Keisha, who had died of a cardiac event at 34 years old. David had died in a construction accident 3 months later, the kind of accident that happens when a company skips safety inspections and nobody says anything about it. Raymond had noted the company's name. He had opened a second file. Zoe had lived with Raymond for 3 years by the time they walked into Harlan's Auto and Body on that cold morning in November. She had inherited David's eyes and Keisha's particular quality of stillness, the kind of stillness that was not passivity but was instead a careful accumulation of information before speaking. She read 2 grade levels above her year. She had opinions about breakfast foods that were strongly held and well articulated. She had a best friend at Clover Ridge Elementary named Priya, whose mother occasionally watched Zoe on the rare evenings Raymond had to drive to Cincinnati for meetings he couldn't take over the phone. Raymond had made Zoe's life as ordinary as a life could be when it was being lived by a child who had lost 2 parents before age 6. He drove her to school every morning at 7:45. He packed her lunch himself. He attended every conference, every recital, every school fundraiser where parents were encouraged to come and buy aggressively mediocre baked goods for prices that made no economic sense. He coached her 5th grade flag football team on Thursday afternoons. He had been doing all of this while simultaneously running the longest and most complex investigation of his career. Nobody in Clover Ridge knew this. That was entirely the point. Harlan's Auto and Body had been a fixture of Route 9 for 44 years. Diane Harlan had taken over from her father Roy in 2008 when Roy's knees finally stopped cooperating. She had run the shop with a version of the same philosophy Roy had always had, which was that the customer was not always right, and the mechanic was also not always right, and the only thing that was always right was the vehicle, which told the truth through symptoms and codes and fluids in ways that humans almost never did. Under Diane, the shop had expanded. She had added 2 bays, upgraded the diagnostic equipment, hired 4 additional mechanics. She had a good reputation among the people she chose to serve, and a particular way of not serving people she had decided in the first 30 seconds she didn't want in her shop. This was not a new behavior. Her father had done a version of it too, though his version had been more selective and more quietly maintained. Diane's version had grown more confident over the years, partly because she had never been seriously challenged on it, and partly because the people she turned away had generally not had the time or the resources or the inclination to make it a formal problem. The complaints that did exist about Harlan's Auto and Body were not hard to find. 2 reviews on a regional consumer forum from 2019 described experiences with racial dismissal. Neither had been resolved. 1 review from 2021 described a black woman who had been told the shop was closed at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday with 3 mechanics visibly working inside. That reviewer had left her name and a phone number. Raymond had called her phone number in the spring. Her name was Alicia Warren, and she had told him everything she remembered in 45 minutes on a Tuesday evening while her husband watched television in the next room. Alicia Warren was not the beginning of the file. She was the 14th person Raymond had spoken to. The file on Harlan's Auto and Body had a specific purpose that had nothing to do with Diane Harlan personally. It had everything to do with the fact that Harlan's Auto and Body held 3 active federal service contracts for maintenance and inspection of county-operated vehicles. Federal service contracts came with federal compliance requirements. Federal compliance requirements included non-discrimination provisions. Non-discrimination provisions, when violated in connection with federally funded service contracts, constituted a violation that the Department of Transportation's Office of Inspector General had specific jurisdiction to investigate. The shop had held these contracts for 9 years. The complaints had been documented for 7. The investigation that had brought Raymond to Clover Ridge had at its center a much larger fraud case involving a regional construction and infrastructure company named Tolliver Brothers Holdings. Tolliver Brothers held contracts across 6 counties in central and northern Ohio. They had been for the past 11 years systematically overbilling the federal government for work partially or never completed on public road and bridge infrastructure. The overcharging was deliberate, sustained, and nested inside a structure of legitimate billing that made it invisible to standard audit procedures. Harlan's Auto and Body was not the main event. It was a thread, a specific thread that, when pulled properly, connected to a subcontractor relationship with Tolliver Brothers that Raymond had been working to fully document for the past 8 months. Diane Harlan believed she was a woman running her late father's shop on a busy state route in Clover Ridge, Ohio. She was also, without knowing it, about to become the point at which 11 years of federal investigation fully surfaced. Raymond had not gone to the shop that morning to be turned away. He had gone to the shop that morning because his transmission was genuinely grinding, and he had a legitimate need for service, and because the federal compliance audit that his office had been preparing to execute for the past 6 weeks required one final documented instance of discriminatory refusal of service under the active federal contract period. He had gotten what he needed in less than 4 minutes. The note he typed on his phone in the parking lot went directly to Agent Constance Adeyemi in Cincinnati. The text read, "Documentation complete. Proceed." She called him back at 7:52 as he was pulling into the school drop-off line. Adeyemi said, "You're sure it's clean?" Raymond said, "She told me Sandra doesn't schedule. Sandra's name is on the appointment log from yesterday. I have the recording." He had, of course, been recording the interaction. He had been authorized to do so. He had been authorized to do a great many things in Clover Ridge for 4 years that he had done so quietly that none of the people around him had noticed any of them. Adeyemi said, "Then we're moving. I'm calling the U.S. Attorney's Office this morning, joint coordination with the Compliance Division and the FBI Field Office in Columbus. We've got enough on Tolliver Brothers to execute, and the Harlan documentation closes the last evidentiary gap on the subcontractor conspiracy count." Raymond said, "What's the timeline?" Adeyemi said, "Today. I'm not waiting another week with what we've got." There was a pause. She said, "You did good work, Raymond. 11 years of good work." He said, "I had good help." Zoe was unbuckling beside him. She pulled her backpack from the back seat and her thermos, which she had finished on the ride. She looked at him. He was still on the phone, and he pointed at the door. She mouthed, "Today?" He didn't answer because she wasn't supposed to know what today meant, except that she had been living with a federal investigator for 3 years and was, in the assessment of literally every adult who had ever spoken with her, alarmingly perceptive. He would address that later. She got out of the truck and jogged toward the school entrance, her backpack bouncing. At the door she turned and gave him a wave that was more of a salute. He drove back toward Route 9. The plan, as Adeyemi had described it, involved a coordinated execution across 3 sites beginning at approximately 12:30 p.m. The primary site was the Tolliver Brothers Holdings main office in Westerville. The second site was a storage facility in Sunbury, where financial records and hard drives had been identified. The third site was Harlan's Auto and Body on Route 9 in Clover Ridge, where a forensic accounting team would audit the federal contract documentation and 3 federal agents would formally present the compliance investigation findings to Diane Harlan. Raymond's role in the third site execution was not to go inside the shop. His role was to be present as the lead case investigator on the subcontractor thread, in case any evidentiary questions arose that required his direct knowledge of the case file. He would arrive in a government vehicle. He would park across the street. He would wait. He had been waiting in various forms for 4 years. He was good at it. At 12:17 p.m., a black government SUV came down Route 9 from the north and pulled into the parking lot of the convenience store opposite Harlan's Auto and Body. Raymond was already there, in his own truck, wearing the same jacket he had worn that morning. At 12:20, 3 additional vehicles came from the south. 2 of them were unmarked federal vehicles, serious, rectangular, moving with the particular unhurried certainty of things that do not need to announce themselves in advance. The third was not unmarked. It was a military-style logistics truck, olive green, from the Ohio National Guard's Transportation Support Unit that had been coordinating with the FBI Field Office on equipment support for the Tolliver Brothers site execution in Westerville. It had come down Route 9 because Route 9 was the most direct connector from the highway to the Harlan address, and the navigation system did not know or care that this was the same street that a woman had turned away a black man and his daughter at 7:15 that morning. Behind it was a second military truck. Same unit, same unhurried certainty. They turned into the Harlan's auto and body parking lot in a line. Raymond watched from across the street. He watched a mechanic in a grey uniform step out of Bay 2 and look at the trucks. The mechanic put his wrench down slowly, the way people put things down when their hands have received news before their brain has. He watched 2 federal agents get out of the first vehicle, then a third from the second. They were wearing jackets with agency identifiers on the back. They walked toward the shop's main entrance with a collection of documents in a federal compliance folder that was, by the standards of federal compliance folders, quite large. He watched the bell above the door ring as they went in. He could not hear it from across the street, but he knew it rang. Diane Harlan was eating a sandwich at her desk when the bell rang the second time that morning, and she looked up expecting a customer. What she saw was a federal compliance agent named Brenda Okafor, who introduced herself with a badge and a case number and the name of the specific federal compliance division she represented, and then introduced the 2 agents behind her, and then set a compliance notification letter on Diane's desk with the kind of calm that government representatives develop after years of delivering information that changes the temperature of a room permanently. Agent Okafor said, "Ms. Harlan, this is a formal notification of a federal contract compliance investigation under the terms of the non-discrimination provisions attached to your active federal service contracts. Contract numbers," she read them, all 3 of them, slowly and completely. Diane put her sandwich down. Okafor said, "This investigation has been active for 27 months. It is connected to a broader federal case being executed simultaneously at multiple sites in Ohio this afternoon. We are here to audit your contract documentation and to conduct a formal interview. You are entitled to have counsel present. If you would like to contact an attorney before we proceed, you may do so now." Diane looked at the 2 agents behind Okafor. She looked at the badge. She looked at the letter on her desk. She said, "What case?" Okafor said, "The case number is on the letter. The lead investigator for the subcontractor compliance thread of this investigation has been working in Clover Ridge for 4 years. Diane said, "Who?" Okafor said the name. Diane's face did something that was not an expression exactly. It was more like the moment when a picture that seemed abstract resolves into something specific and you can't make it abstract again. She said, "The man who came in this morning?" Okafor said yes. Diane sat with that for a moment. Through the window she could see the parking lot. She could see the military trucks. She could see the federal vehicles. She could see across the street at the convenience store a man in a grey jacket sitting in the cab of a 2009 Chevy Silverado with a grinding transmission, not looking at the shop, just present, just waiting, the way he had apparently been waiting for 4 years in a town that had not known he was there. The interview lasted 3 hours. The audit team was thorough and specific and completely unsurprised by everything they found because Raymond's case file had already told them what they were going to find. The compliance violations were documented across 9 years of contract activity. The connection to the Tolliver Brothers subcontracting arrangement involved 7 specific billing periods and a shared documentation structure that Raymond had identified and cross-referenced 18 months earlier. Diane Harlan answered questions for 3 hours in the presence of her attorney, who had arrived 45 minutes into the process, and who had, in the first few minutes of reviewing the compliance notification letter, gone very quiet in the particular way that attorneys go quiet when they understand the magnitude of what they are reading. Raymond did not go into the shop. He sat in his truck until 2:30, at which point Adeyemi called to confirm that all 3 sites were secure, and the primary execution at Tolliver Brothers had been completed without complication. He said thank you. He said he would write the final case summary by end of week. Then he drove to Clover Ridge Elementary and arrived 11 minutes before dismissal. He parked in the pickup lane and waited. When Zoe came out, she was talking to Priya, both of them walking with the particular energy of children who have been inside all day and are now processing their entire backlog of thoughts simultaneously. Zoe spotted the truck and said something to Priya and jogged over. She climbed in. She looked at his face. She said, "It happened today, didn't it?" He said, "How was school?" She said, "Raymond?" He said, "It happened today." She said, "Is it over?" He said, "The big part." She said, "What about the shop lady?" He said, "That part too." Zoe looked out the windshield for a moment. Then she said, "Good." He said, "Priya's mom is making dinner on Saturday. You're invited?" Zoe said, "I know. She texted me." He said, "She texted you." She said, "We're friends." He said, "You're 9." She said, "9-year-olds have phones now." He said, "Not this one." She said, "Priya has a phone." He said, "Priya's mom makes different choices." Zoe pulled her thermos from her bag and shook it, empty. She looked at it philosophically. She said, "Can we make soup tonight?" He said, "We can make soup tonight." She buckled her seatbelt and they pulled out of the pickup lane and back into the ordinary traffic of an ordinary afternoon in Clover Ridge, Ohio, where nothing in particular had changed and everything in particular had. That evening, Diane Harlan drove home to the house on Creekside Road she had lived in since her divorce 15 years earlier. It was a 3-bedroom house with a detached garage and a kitchen her father had helped her remodel in 2004 and a back porch she had not sat on in 2 years because it failed faced the yard where Roy used to grow tomatoes, and she had not replanted it, and the bare patch of soil still looked like waiting. She made herself tea. She sat at the kitchen table with the compliance letter in front of her, and her attorney's card beside it, and the accumulated quiet of a house where she had been the only person for a decade and a half. Her attorney had been direct. The violations were documented. The connection to Tolliver Brothers was documented. The question was no longer whether but how much, and in what form the consequences would take shape. There were things she could do cooperatively, and things she could do uncooperatively, and the difference between those two things was significant. She had said she understood. What she was sitting with now was not the legal situation. Her attorney would manage the legal situation. What she was sitting with was the specific image of a man at her counter that morning, a man who had driven 20 minutes to bring his daughter to a shop that had an appointment in the log under a name she had dismissed in 12 seconds, a man who had stood there quietly while she lied to him in plain daylight, a man who had then walked out with his daughter, gotten in his truck, and typed a note that had put 4 years of federal investigation into motion. He had not argued with her. He had not raised his voice. He had not told her what he was. He had not needed to. He had done his job, which was apparently to be so thoroughly unremarkable in this town for so long that no one had looked at him twice, and then to walk into her shop at 7:15 in the morning with a grinding transmission and a 9-year-old carrying a thermos of hot chocolate, and to stand there for 4 minutes while she confirmed, on a federal recording, exactly who she was. She thought about the child. The child had said nothing, had just watched. Those eyes. Diane's father had told her once, near the end, that the thing he regretted most about the way he had run the shop was not any specific decision but a quality of attention he had paid to certain people that he had not paid to others. He had said it obliquely, in the way that old men sometimes confess things by talking about them as if they are about someone else. She had not pressed him on it. She had not wanted to know. She thought about that now. She looked at the backyard through the kitchen window, the bare patch, the absence where the tomatoes used to be. She did not come to any conclusions that night because conclusions were not available yet. What was available was the beginning of understanding that the version of herself she had been operating as for a very long time was not the version of herself she had thought she was. That was not a small thing. It was also not a finished thing. It was a starting thing. And starting, even when it comes too late and costs too much, is the only door that opens from the inside. Raymond filed his case summary on Thursday and submitted it to Adeyemi by noon. She read it and called him at 2. She said, "You wrote 11,000 words for a summary." He said, "It's a thorough summary." She said, "The U.S. Attorney's Office will love you." He said, "They don't have to love me. They just have to use it." She said, "They will." Raymond, the Tolliver Brothers case is going to result in the largest federal transportation fraud recovery in Ohio in 20 years. You know that, right? He said, "I know." She said, "How's the kid?" He said, "Made me soup Tuesday night. Put too much dill in it." Adeyemi laughed. She said, "You're going to have to tell her eventually what you do, what this was." Raymond said, "She already knows more than she's supposed to." Adeyemi said, "She's your kid. Of course she does." After he hung up, he sat at his kitchen table for a while. The house was quiet. Zoe was at school. The soup pot was on the stove, clean now, upside down on the drying rack. Through the front window, he could see the ordinary street, the 2 houses across from his, the bare-branched maple that had gone fully yellow in October and was now stripped down to its winter shape, which was honest and angular and somehow more itself than it had been in full leaf. He thought about David. He thought about David the way he always thought about David, which was in specific small images. David at 8 years old eating cereal at the counter. David at 19 trying to explain to their father why he had decided to marry Keisha after knowing her for 4 months, making the argument with so much earnest logic that their father had started laughing and been unable to stop. David on the phone from the construction site that last summer, calling to say he had gotten promoted to crew lead, his voice carrying the specific quality of pride that sounds like it was not built for pride and has had to learn. Zoe had David's voice, not the sound of it, but the quality, the earnestness underneath the directness, the way she argued her position with logic and then, if the logic didn't work, looked at you with an expression that said she was going to come back to this. Raymond had told her very little about what her father had done for work. He had told her even less about the second file he had opened after David's death, the construction company that had skipped the safety inspections on the crew David was leading. The documentation of what had been skipped and why and at whose direction. That case had concluded 18 months ago. He had not been in the courtroom for the sentencing. He had been on that particular Tuesday at a flag football practice where Zoe had intercepted a pass and run it back 40 yards and turned to look at him from the end zone with an expression that was not celebrating the interception but was asking him a question, the same question she always asked with her eyes, which was, "Are you watching? Are you here? Is this real?" He had stood on the sideline with his arms crossed and nodded once. She had grinned and spiked the flag. 2 Saturdays after the execution at Harlan's Auto and Body, Raymond was raking the front yard. The maple had finally finished dropping and the leaves had distributed themselves with the specific democracy of wind across the entire lawn and the 2 flower beds that he maintained in a minimal and functional way. Zoe was inside reading. She had a library book due on Monday and had announced at breakfast that she was going to finish it today and that this was non-negotiable, which was an exact reproduction of a phrase he used approximately twice a week and which she deployed with the same flat certainty he did, which should have been alarming but was mostly just accurate. He heard footsteps on the sidewalk and looked up. Diane Harlan was standing at the edge of his yard. She was wearing a dark coat and no makeup, which was different from how she looked at the shop. She was carrying a glass dish covered in foil. She looked like a person who had rehearsed what they were going to say and had now arrived at the moment of saying it and found that all the rehearsed words had become unavailable. She said, "I made too much of this. It's a chicken casserole." Raymond stopped raking. He looked at her. He looked at the dish. He said, "That was considerate." Diane said, "I looked up your address. I know that might seem forward." He said, "It's a small town." She said, "I want to say something." He waited. She said, "What I did that morning and every other morning I did it for all those years. I want to say that I know it was wrong. I've known it for a long time and I didn't stop. That's not something I can fix by bringing a casserole. I understand that. But I needed to be standing somewhere specific and saying it out loud to you specifically and not to my attorney and not in a deposition." Raymond held the rake. Diane said, "You didn't yell at me. You didn't tell me who you were. You just left." He said, "I had what I needed." She said, "Your daughter, is she okay?" He said, "She's fine. She's reading." Diane looked at the house. She looked at the covered dish in her hands. She said, "I don't think I can repair it. I know that." He said, "Nobody's asking you to repair it in one trip." She held out the dish. He took it. There was a silence between them that was not comfortable but was honest, and honest was the only kind of silence that was appropriate to the situation. The front door opened. Zoe appeared in the doorway, holding her library book with one finger marking her page. She looked at Diane. She looked at the casserole dish now in her uncle's hands. She looked at Diane again. She said, "Hi." Diane said, "Hi." Zoe said, "Is that food?" Diane said, "Chicken casserole." Zoe said, "We have enough casserole dishes. You can take yours back at some point." Raymond said, Zoe said, "I'm just saying we have a lot of dishes." She looked at Diane one more time with the steady, cataloging attention she had been applying to adults her entire life. Then she looked at Raymond. She communicated something with her eyes that he received and understood and chose not to comment on. She said, "I'm going back to my book." She went back inside. The door closed. Diane looked at the door. She said, "She's something." Raymond said, "She is." Diane pulled her coat tighter and looked at the street. Then she said she should get going, and he said, "Thank you for the dish," and she nodded and walked back to the sidewalk and then back down the street the way she had come, not looking back. Raymond stood in the yard for another moment, the dish warm in his hands through the foil, the rake leaning against his shoulder. Down the block, a dog was barking at something it hadn't identified yet. The maple stood bare and angular at the edge of the property. Somewhere above the cloud cover, the sun was still there, doing its quiet work. He carried the dish inside. The truck got fixed on a Wednesday in December at a shop in Millbury that a colleague of his had recommended. It was not the closest shop, and it was not the cheapest shop, but the mechanic, a man named Tom Castillo, who had been running the place since his father retired, shook Raymond's hand when he arrived and got down on his back to look under the truck before he said a single word about price. He said, "Transmission's not as bad as you thought. I can have it done by Friday." Raymond said, "That works." Tom said, "You can leave the kid if she wants to watch. I don't mind." Zoe, who had come along for the ride since it was a teacher workday, looked at the shop. She looked at the lift. She looked at Tom's collection of organized tools on the wall, which were arranged by type and by size, and which she was already moving toward. She said, "Can you tell me how the transmission works?" Tom said, "You've got a few hours." She said, "Yes." Tom said, "Then pull up that stool." Raymond left his daughter in the shop learning how a transmission works from a man who was happy to explain it, and he walked to the coffee place 2 doors down and ordered a medium coffee and sat in the window and watched the ordinary life of a Wednesday street in December. A woman walking a small dog, a postal carrier with an arm full of packages, a kid on a bicycle moving too fast for the conditions, looking exactly like he was supposed to look. Raymond drank his coffee and did not think about the case because the case was finished. He thought about next Thursday, which was Zoe's school winter recital, and about whether he had confirmed with Priya's mom about carpooling, and about the grocery list on his phone that had been there for 5 days and still contained only 4 items. He thought about his brother. He thought about how David would have handled the last 4 years. David would have been terrible at undercover work. David was constitutionally incapable of small talk. He would have found a way to fix everything, some things too fast, and some things too slow, and he would have burned a lot of bridges and built new ones in the same week, and Zoe would have had a very different childhood and possibly a more exciting one. But the work would not have been done. The work required the specific kind of patience that Raymond had, not the patience of passivity, the patience of a person who understands that the slowest way is sometimes the only way, and who goes at the pace the work requires regardless of whether that pace is visible or legible or recognized by anyone else. He finished his coffee and walked back to the shop. Tom and Zoe were deep in conversation about gear ratios. Zoe had found a piece of paper and was drawing a diagram. Tom was pointing at parts of the drawing and nodding. Raymond leaned against the doorframe and watched. Zoe looked up and saw him and held up the paper. She said, "I understand transmissions now." He said, "That's great." She said, "We should have learned this before." He said, "We're learning it now." She looked at the diagram for another moment. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her jacket pocket, which was the gesture of a person who intends to keep something. Raymond looked out through the open shop door at the December sky, grey and close, the kind of sky that holds everything quietly and gives nothing back yet. He had a grocery list to finish and a recital to attend and 11 years of federal work that had ended the way good work always ends, not with noise but with documents, not with vindication but with consequence, not with a moment anyone would make a movie about, but with the steady, unremarkable satisfaction of having done a thing completely. He put his hands in his pockets. He breathed the cold air coming through the open door. He stayed.